Mordheim, City of the Damned, is a tabletop wargame for 2 to 6 players made by Games Workshop back in the year 1999. It's a turn-based tactical game set in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, in the post-apocalyptic ruins of an empire city. Players will lead warbands of heroes and henchmen into deadly skirmishes. The game emphasizes survival and careful engagement, as losing battles can result in permanent injuries or death for warband members. Amongst veteran Warhammer players, Mordheim is a game of legend. And if you've ever heard the stories about the City of the Damned, and it's caught your interest, well, you've come to the right place, because this video is going to tell you absolutely everything you need to know to play the tabletop game Mordheim. This video is incredibly extensive. Not only are we going to talk about how to actually play the game of Mordheim, but I'm going to assume that you are someone that is completely new to tabletops. We will go over the basics of playing tabletop war games. We will go over, again, how to play the actual game Mordheim itself, and we will talk about how to actually run it in a campaign setting. Finally, I will discuss all of the official optional additions that Games Workshop has added to Mordheim since its first release, how to use those in a game, which ones we typically use in our community, and we'll discuss a couple of house rules and balance changes that the community at large has kind of implemented for games of Mordheim. Before we get to any of those, I will be making sure that the base game is clearly explained and put an emphasis that if you've never tried Mordheim before, to just try that experience first. But I will also be, as I mentioned, discussing some balance changes and optional rules that have been introduced to the game since its original inception in 1999. And so begins our journey in learning the tabletop game Mordheim. You're going to want 1 or 2 tape measures when you play a game of Mordheim. All range values, movement, shooting a gun, charging, everything is listed and measured in inches. The game also uses what is often referred to as a D6 system for all dice interaction-based mechanics. And what that means is a 6-sided dice. You're going to want a good amount of these. I would recommend having at least 10 or 15 available. But it's not quite like a larger game of Warhammer, which you might see at stores where you got like 50 or 60 guys on the table. So it's not like you need much more than that, I would say. Mordheim and most Warhammer games in general are played at the, I believe it's called like the 28mm heroic scale. Although this has changed a bit nowadays, and I think things have kind of gone up to 30. But when it comes to like older Warhammer games like this, it's on the 28. And I know for a lot of old world players, base sizes have gone up, but Mordheim does use the smaller base sizes. But I've seen a lot of people use circle bases that are just like the same millimeter. I don't even think you need to necessarily be tied to square base. If you're one of those people that doesn't like the whole square base thing, you can actually do these on 20mm like circle bases or 25mm circle bases. And I think on that note, you're fine to play with the slightly larger base sizes that I know Old World has been encouraging players to go towards. But just be lenient with whoever you're playing with and make sure there's a mutual understanding on like, hey, like this is supposed to be on 20mm instead of 25. I'll list all the official sizes here if you want to model your warband for authenticity. I'll show a couple of kits here on the screen that are good for just starting out for building a Mordheim warband, but it's kind of a blessing and a curse. When it comes to playing Mordheim nowadays, there's no official support. It's kind of just free to the public to do whatever they want with it now. So Games Workshop doesn't necessarily have all the models you need to build everything that might be listed in your warband roster, so you'll have to be a little bit creative, and there's not really any proxies because, again, there's no like listed supply of all the stuff that you need nowadays. You can find some of the models still online, like the actual official things, but they're like ridiculously priced. Especially some of the official Mordheim stuff, like getting an old rulebook for Mordheim is a rarity nowadays. You're probably gonna have to print one out, but luckily all that stuff's ready and able, and I think as long as you do a good job with the hobby side of everything, it'll work smoothly. I definitely use a lot of creative models nowadays instead of using like the official stuff. I would definitely recommend looking up some kind of reference picture and see what you should be building towards, and try to honor that as best as you can when it comes to making whatever it is for your warband. Even when this game was officially supported by Games Workshop, it was just encouraging oodles of creativity. They wanted you to kit bash Free Company militia with other stuff and just make whatever you can to represent your warband. So that aspect of creativity, if anything, is even more encouraged now that it's not even necessarily tied to Games Workshop as a brand. You can use whatever models you want. We live in a world of 3D printing. The options are endless. Just make sure you're trying to hit that ideal scale and reference for whatever it is you're building. It's the key thing when it comes to actually making the miniatures for your warband. And you're going to want as much terrain as possible. Mordheim is set in the City of the Damned, and although a huge comet did considerable damage to the city and definitely transformed it in some considerable ways as well, there are a lot of remains of ruined buildings left behind, and that sense of elevation is a key to the gameplay mechanics and the terrain that should be present in a Mordheim game. I'll show some examples here on the screen. Not all of these are my tables, just like some awesome stuff I've seen amongst the Mordheim community here. But yeah, you are going to want as many kind of buildings as you can squeeze in onto the board. You know, obviously leave some space for city streets and alleyways and avenues for like clear shooting attacks and stuff, but this is definitely supposed to be a dense urban environment. But the rules for Mordheim do support playing in like forests, jungles, and other types of terrain. So if you want to try to use something outside of the standard city, I would highly recommend looking at all the expansions that are available on the links I'll be providing. I know that there's a really cool Lustria, like, jungle scenario for Mordheim, and obviously you're not going to be needing tons of buildings for that. You're going to be needing a lot of jungle-based terrain for that. So, kind of depends on what you want to do, but again, for your standard games in Mordheim, it's going to be set in the City of the Damned, and people are going to be expecting a densely packed city street left in ruin from the comet that struck it. Other than that, you're going to need at least one, or if you can get more players, even better. I think Mordheim excels in a campaign type setting or a league. Like, the more people you can get playing, the better, and compare each other's war bands and progress and have different types of opponents. That's a lot of fun, but yeah, you're going to need at least one person to play against, and they're going to need a war band as well. It's also easy enough to incorporate multiple players in a game of Mordheim. However, it does slow the game down the more players, warbands you get present on the table. I would recommend capping it around 6 on a table at once, because after that, it can get a little too chaotic. In Mordheim, each of your characters, or miniatures, will be defined by a certain set of characteristics. These are the stats that will tell you how good they are at doing certain things in the world of Mordheim. I'll be going into detail as to what each of these characteristics do throughout the video, but for a quick breakdown, M is going to be for your movement value. This is typically how far your miniature can move each turn in inches. So on the example here, we have a movement of 4, so 4 inches. WS is your weapon skill. This defines how efficient your warrior is at using whatever weapon they have available in a close combat situation. 3, which is what we have here in the example, is what I would say is typically the average in a game of Mordheim. BS is your ballistic skill. This is how proficient the character is with range-based weapons. So basically the same thing as the WS weapon skill stat, but just applying to range weapons. S is your character's strength value, and this represents your character's chance to wound an opponent in close combat. So, unlike other games that you might play, in Mordheim, you typically have to roll to hit an opponent, and then you have to roll to wound the opponent. The weapon skill stat is what will define your chance to hit, or the BS stat if it's a range attack. When it comes to wounding the opponent, the S, or strength value, is what will tell you your chance to wound the target. And directly relating to that is T, for toughness. This is the durability of the target receiving the attack, the chance that they actually will be wounded. Perhaps the target is very brawny and muscular, so they might have a very high toughness. But they might not be the most proficient with a weapon, so they might have a weapon skill of 2. And we'll say that that brawny toughness gives them a toughness of 4. This means that model is a character that's easy to hit in a melee, but he's going to be tough to wound. And this might influence what type of weapon you would want to approach that opponent with. Again, we'll be giving further examples and breakdowns of how all these mechanics work later in the video. W is for wounds, and this represents how many wounds your character can actually endure from an attack before they could potentially die in a game of Mordheim. I will be going over this as well later in the video, but when your character's wound value is reduced to 0, you have to roll on an injury chart in Mordheim, and there's a chance they could get knocked down, there's a chance they could get stunned, or they could be killed from whatever the blow is. But this only happens when their wound value is actually reduced to 0. So the more wounds you have, the less likely you'll actually sustain an attack that'll make you roll on that injury chart and potentially die. I is for initiative. Initiative represents how fast your character is in a melee, or just their proficiency at climbing objects or performing acrobatic feats. Their speed, if you will. Normally, whoever has the higher initiative in a melee will be the one that attacks first. A is for attacks, and this is how many attacks your miniature will get in a melee. This is not how many attacks they get with a ranged weapon. That will be listed under whatever ranged weapon profile they are using. So if you have like a pistol, you'll check the stat line for a pistol and it'll tell you how many attacks the pistol gets. A is only applicable for how many melee attacks a character gets. And whatever that number is, he will roll that many dice to see if he can hit his opponent and then wound him and potentially kill him. The final stat is LD, which is your leadership. This represents the courage of your character, and oftentimes you will have to make what are called leadership tests. And this will represent your character's stoic nature in a fearful or dangerous situation, such as fighting 2-to-1 odds. Normally, your average man would be a little bit scared in that situation and potentially run away. However, a character with a high leadership value has a much better chance of standing his ground and fighting the two opponents at once. Speaking of which, we will use that as my segue into characteristic tests. These are common things that you'll hear for terminology in Warhammer games or just Games Workshop games in general, and what they are often referring to is rolling dice and testing a certain characteristic that I just listed, such as the LD or leadership test. We'll start with that one because it's actually a little bit different in Mordheim than all the other characteristic tests. It's similar to other Games Workshop games, but again, I'll go over how the other characteristics work after this one. So an LD test is done by rolling 2 dice, and you want to roll equal to or under whatever your LD value is. So if I have a leadership of 8 and I roll 2 dice, I want to get equal to or under 8. So this is why, as I said earlier, having a higher leadership means your character has a better chance of sticking around in a difficult mental or leader psychological based situation. All of the other characteristic tests such as, say, if I needed to make a initiative test, are done by just rolling one dice, and you want to roll equal to or under whatever the listed number is. So, to give an example, if I have an initiative value of 3, I want to get equal to or under a 3 on a single dice. The higher my initiative is, the better the chance of me passing an initiative test. Something that I will bring up, this also applies to leadership, is there are always a chance of success and always a chance of failure on each of these characteristic tests. So on an initiative test, if I roll 1, I always pass, regardless of what my initiative is or any other modifiers. If I roll a 6, it is always a failure, and it's bearing in mind the pre-constraints I just listed. When it comes to making a leadership test, unless there is something special listed, if I roll double 1s, that is always considered a pass, and if I roll double 6s, that is always considered a failure. In Mordheim, each player will do all of the actions that they are allotted during their respective phases for their turn, and then after that's completed, the next player will go. Once all players have done this sequence, that'll be the end of a full turn. Mordheim differs from your typical game of Warhammer in the sense that it has a progression system that carries over from each game you play in, as well as objective-focused gameplay. It also doesn't rely on regimental unit formations. Instead, things are much smaller scale, and your units will operate independently on the battlefield, with your average warband size ranging between 12 to 15 guys. Objectives typically focus around gathering weirdstone throughout the city of Mordheim that can be sold for gold to upgrade your troops. Sometimes other things, such as monsters or treasure chests, can also be present on the board that can provide additional options to your gameplay. You also can earn experience points for defeating enemies on the battlefield, and as such, your warband will become more powerful the more games your men survive. They can also be permanently killed or receive crippling injuries, such as a missing limb. The turn sequence goes as follows: the recovery phase, the movement phase, the shooting phase, and close combat. The recovery phase is when you may attempt to rally individuals who have lost their nerve and recover models that have knocked down or been stunned during a prior close combat or shooting encounter. The movement phase is when you may move your warriors, or you may attempt to charge. The shooting phase is when you will be shooting your ranged weapons, and a lot of times is when spells are going to be cast. There are a few exceptions to this, but typically most spells are conducted during the shooting phase. And then finally, hand-to-hand combat. Your minis that have successfully charged another opponent will roll it out during this phase and see who comes out the winner. So to start with, the recovery phase is when you can rally your troops. This is done like most games of Warhammer. You roll 2d6 and try to make a leadership test. If the test is passed, the model collects his composure, will be unable to do anything else for the remainder of the turn, but on the following one can act as normal. You are allowed to use your general or your warband leader, whatever term you prefer, their leadership if you desire on this test. The range to do so is 6 inches from your leader. If the test is failed, the model will continue to flee whatever direction they should be going. The final thing to make note of, and I will go into a little bit more detail on this during the shooting and close combat phase, is that if you have a miniature in your warband that has been either knocked down or stunned, they will basically progress one further step towards their recovery. So if your model has been stunned, they will now become knocked down, and if your model has been knocked down, they will now be standing up. This is the final thing that you'll be doing during the recovery phase, unless you have some kind of spell or special item that triggers during this phase as well. Continuing on to the movement phase. The first thing that you have to do, if you desire, during the movement phase, is declare any charges. In Mordheim, there's no pre-measuring at any time. which is going to play a key component to the charges. New players of Warhammer will have to adapt their mindset to this older way of playing. And it's going to be very important that you do so, because when declaring a charge, you don't roll any dice to add to your movement value on the charge. Instead, you just go directly towards the enemy, double your movement value in the closest path possible. If you are unable to complete this action, or perhaps you don't have enough movement to make it to your target, this will be considered a failed charge. You will go half of your listed movement value towards the enemy, be stuck in that location, be unable to shoot, and really the only thing you can do at that point is attempt to cast spells. You are also allowed to charge an enemy model within 4 inches of you that you can't see, because perhaps they might be hidden behind a piece of terrain. But this model that you're charging cannot be declared hidden. Your model must pass an initiative test to detect this foe. If you fail the roll, your model may not charge, but it may continue with their turn as normal. Should also be made note of that if the target they're charging causes fear or some other kind of psychological effect, the model that's declaring the charge will have to make a leadership test, and if they fail, that'll also be considered a failed charge, and they will just sit there quivering in their boots as they stare at their enemy. The final thing I want to make note of for charges is a very unique mechanic to Mordheim, in that if the person receiving the charge happens to have a friendly model within 2 inches of the charge path, they can choose to have that model intercept the target. The model that originally declared the charge in this situation still receives all the benefits and counts as charging, and the model that is intercepting is required to make any appropriate psychological tests if they're required. Perhaps the model charging causes fear, and that also works both ways. Perhaps the model intercepting causes fear, and now the charger will have to make a psychological test. And that's going to just about wrap up the basics of charging in Mordheim. Standard movement in Mordheim is pretty straightforward. You're allowed to move any direction you desire. You can sprint, and doing so is considered double your character's listed movement rate. So for example, a human has a movement rate of 4. This would mean their sprint value is 8 inches. You are also allowed to hide and perform climbing actions during the movement phase. It should be noted that if you decide to have one of your characters sprint, they will be forfeiting their ability to shoot during that turn. However, they are still allowed to cast spells if they have the ability to do so, as well as forfeiting the ability to perform a climb action and a hide action. Declaring a hide action makes it so a model doing so cannot be targeted by range or magic attacks or an enemy charge unless the opposing model is within their initiative value worth of inches. So a warrior with an initiative value of 3 would have a detection range of 3 inches. If the hidden model is within this detection range, it is going to be too difficult to conceal yourself and they will automatically be detected. Additionally, a model that is hidden cannot cast spells or shoot unless they wish to reveal their position and no longer be considered hidden. To perform a climb action, a model must make an initiative test. If he fails to do so while climbing up, he can't move that turn. If he fails while in the middle of a climb or climbing down, he falls from where he started the descent, and we will go into that when we get into the falling section very soon. And if you're curious how to perform an initiative test, this is done by rolling a d6 and rolling equal to or under the model's initiative value. The roll of a 6 is always considered a failure, and the roll of a 1 is always considered a success. Should you succeed in your initiative test, you are permitted to climb your movement value worth of distance vertically up the building. Or if you had to use an inch or 2 to get to the building, you are then allowed another inch or 2 for your climb. If you lack the movement to climb the total distance, then you are unable to climb over that object, unfortunately. This will be leading into the next section, which is known as jumping. You're allowed to jump down from high places up to a maximum distance of 6 inches, and for each 2 inches that you jump during the sequence, you are required to perform an initiative test. So just to give a quick example, if you are jumping down a distance of 6 inches, that's going to require 3 initiative tests from that character. If he fails any of those initiative tests, he will be considered a falling miniature and take falling damage. The model will take D3 hits at a strength value equal to the height he fell in inches. So, as an example, if the model fell 4 inches, he would take D3 hits at a strength value of 4. No armor saves may be applied. Falling will not cause critical hits, and a model that falls may not move any further or hide during that turn, even if they were not hurt. The final thing to talk about when it comes to jumping is you are also allowed to jump over gaps, up to a maximum of 3 inches. Deduct the distance jumped from the model's movement, but remember you cannot measure the distance before you perform the jump. If your model does not have enough movement to jump the distance, he automatically falls. If the model is able to cover the distance, he must make an initiative test, or fall. A model may also jump over a gap and still fire a missile weapon if it's not going to be continuing the turn with a run action, and it may also jump as part of its charge or running move if desired. The final thing that you can do with these jumps is you can perform a diving charge. If there's going to be an enemy model within 2 inches of the location where your model would land, you can declare a diving charge against it. Take an initiative test for each 2 inches of height your model needs to jump down from, up to a maximum of 6. If he fails any of the tests, your model has fallen and suffers the appropriate amount of damage, and may not move any further during the movement phase, and cannot charge the enemy. If he succeeds, the model gains a +1 strength bonus on the charge, and a +1 bonus to hit the opponent during the following hand-to-hand combat phase. There are many types of terrain features that you'll encounter in Mordheim, but typically you will find open ground, difficult ground, very difficult ground, walls and debris, and buildings in elevated positions, as I was kind of mentioning earlier during the climbing section. Open ground is exactly what you would expect. Open surface area that can be freely traversed, and doesn't really affect your movement in any way or slow down your characters. Difficult ground is a little bit different. It's considered steep or treacherous slopes, bushes, and angled rooftops of buildings, and because of this, your models will be moving half speed when going over difficult terrain. Very difficult ground is really dangerous, such as a narrow crawl hole through the rubble. Models may only move at a quarter rate, so if you got 4 inches, you're only able to move 1 inch over very difficult ground. And then the final thing is walls and barriers. As long as these are 1 inch or less in height, your minis can actually hop over these with ease, but they will provide cover to them if they're under the threat of a range attack. Being high up in a building can provide vantage points for minis that are performing shooting attacks. Normally, when you take a shooting attack, and I will be going over this soon, you're required to shoot at the closest target possible. However, if you have the advantage of a high up position, you're allowed to pick your targets freely. Additionally, if you happen to have a character that is stunned or knocked down within 1 inch of a high up position, like a building ledge perhaps, they will be required to make an initiative test, and if it's failed, the model will fall over the edge of the building towards the ground below. The many walls and ruined buildings over Mordheim will offer ideal positions for your warband to have cover during the oncoming shooting phase. And as long as about 25% of your model is considered obscured by one of these features, he will receive the full benefits of cover. In Mordheim, there is no soft cover, medium cover, or hard cover. It's just always a blanket cover of -1 to hit. And since we've already gone into a couple of the details about it, we will now begin talking about the shooting phase properly. So, who can shoot? Obviously, you need to have a range-based weapon, and each model that does have one is permitted to do a shooting attack once per turn. The model may not fire in the following circumstances: if they are engaged in hand-to-hand combat, has run or failed a charge in the movement phase, has rallied this turn, or is stunned or knocked down. As I already mentioned earlier, you have 360-degree line of sight in this game, and to determine if your mini has line of sight on the target they want to shoot at, you have to basically draw what is called true line of sight. You have to look at where your mini is, and you have to see if that character has visible line of sight to the target. And additionally, as I already mentioned in the cover section earlier, you have to see if that shot is obscured in any way, and if the target should receive the cover benefit. You must always shoot at the closest target, as it represents the most immediate threat. However, there are a few exceptions to this. You are allowed to shoot the easier target if there are multiple present, or you may choose to ignore the closest target if they happen to be stunned or knocked down, as they pose less of immediate threat to the shooter. Finally, you may always choose to shoot at a large target as long as you can see it, whether it's in cover or not, even if it's not the closest target, because it's that easy a target to pick out. I believe I've already mentioned this in an earlier segment, but in case you missed it, if a target happens to be in cover, the penalty for shooting at them is a -1 to hit modifier. Speaking of that, how exactly do we determine how our model is going to hit an enemy? Well, to do so, you're going to look at the ballistic skill of your character, also known as the BS stat. Whatever number that is, you're going to subtract it from 7. So if I have a ballistic skill of 3, and I subtract that from 7, I get a 4. And that is what I'm going to need to hit the target. I'll also show a picture of the chart, in case my little cheating rule there didn't help you. But it should be familiar to players of Warhammer Fantasy, as it's the same to hit system from that game. Rolling to wound a target with a range attack is the same exact principle as a melee attack. You're going to look at the strength of your weapon, and you're going to look at the toughness of the opponent you're shooting at, and compare the values. If the values are equal, say I have a strength 3 bow, and my opponent is a toughness 3 human, I will need a 4 or better to wound that target. If my strength is 1 greater than the target, I will need a 3 or better. If my strength is 2 better than the target's toughness, I will wound them on a 2+. It doesn't really get any better than that, because a 1 is always a failure. Let's say it works in the opposite way, though, where my strength is 3 and the opponent's toughness is 4. Well, I'm going to be wounding them on 5s. Say it goes even further that direction, where my strength is 3 and my opponent's toughness is 5. Well, I'll be wounding them on 6s. It goes one further than that, where I am still allowed to wound a target that is 3 toughness higher than me. But after this, I am no longer able to wound the target, as it is far too sturdy, whatever it is, for my character to wound. Obviously, I have the picture up now of the wound chart, so hopefully this will all be helpful for you, and that little rule of thumb will stick with you. Again, it's the same system used in Warhammer Fantasy. And to wrap up our little section here on shooting, I already mentioned how cover can be a modifier when rolling to hit. So just to give an example of that, if I have a ballistic skill of 3 and I'm shooting at a target in cover, I normally hit on 4s, and the way I got that was by taking the number 3 and subtracting it from 7. So I am normally hitting on 4s, and the target is in cover. So that's an additional -1, which means I'm going to be hitting them on 5s. There are other modifiers, though, that can further affect my roll, such as long range, which will provide an additional -1, or if I'm moving and shooting a weapon that permits that, that's an additional -1. There is a positive modifier in that if you're shooting at a large target, you actually get +1 to hit, but that's about it. In Mordheim, you have a unique mechanic when rolling to wound opponents. If the die you roll to wound a target happens to be a 6, you will be considered eligible for a critical hit, at which point you will either use the default critical hit chart, or if you desire, can use the expanded critical hit chart, and if you're doing so, you will look for the critical hit chart for the weapon your character is using, and you will roll a d6 on that chart. and apply the result rolled. These can be devastating. Sometimes you trigger a critical blow that will ignore the opponent's armor. Other times, they'll be hit with such a forceful blow that they're immediately knocked on their feet, regardless of the result of their armor save or any other further effects, such as they might have multiple wounds on the character. They add a lot of dynamic to the game of Mordheim, and I highly encourage using the expanded critical hit chart. Although I will say it's not perfect, there are a few critical hit charts that are better than others, so you might want to kind of balance it out amongst your play group if you kind of notice there's a bit of a leniency towards one chart over others. But I will say, even if this is the case where one chart's kind of desired over others, there are oftentimes use case scenarios for specific weapons and their specific critical hit charts, such as one weapon might be able to, as I mentioned earlier, bypass armor easily. And another weapon might not necessarily do that, but it's better at dealing immediate knockdown or stunned results, which could be more favorable against larger targets that have multiple wounds. So that's kind of a reason I encourage you to try out the expanded critical hit chart. It actually adds a lot to the game, in my opinion. And there'll be a couple other expanded mechanics I'll be touching on during this demo, but I'm not going to go into each of the charts here. The video is going to be long enough already. I've mentioned that once you wound a target, unless some kind of special result from a critical hit, as an example I mentioned earlier, is being applied, that the character being wounded, in a lot of cases, is going to be entitled to an armor save. This is the chart for armor. I'm going to be showing it here on the screen. Light armor gives a 6 up, heavy armor a 5 up, grommel armor a 4 plus, and if you carry a shield, it'll be a +1 modifier to what already existing armor you have, or just provide a 6 up. This result can be modified, though, by the strength of the attack. This kind of represents the ability for the opponent's weapon to puncture through your armor. So if it's a melee attack, you are going to look at the total strength of the user, and if their weapon gives them a bonus, apply that. If it's a range attack, you're just going to be looking at the strength of the ranged weapon. If the strength happens to be above 3, the following modifiers will take effect. A strength 4 blow will give a -1 modifier to the target's armor save. A strength 5 blow will give a -2. Strength 6, -3. And so on. I would recommend seeing how the game plays before modifying anything here, but it's worth mentioning that a lot of Mordheim players, you will see it on quite a few of the Mordheim websites that I'm going to link in the description, as well as my play group, kind of are under the impression armor is not the most valuable things in current Mordheim, and provide a couple of house rules to balance it out and make it more desirable. I'm going to list those on the screen here right now, but I'm going to put it with the preface that this is totally optional. It's just a way that a lot of people like to play the game at this point, since it's been around for so many years. But again, if you're just starting out, I would recommend skipping the optional suggestions here and just playing with the base values for armor. The final thing, even though this isn't necessarily shooting related, that I want to cover is magic in Mordheim. It's a pretty straightforward process where most spells are just going to have a listed casting value, and you are just going to be rolling 2d6 and trying to be getting equal to or higher than the casting value in order to successfully achieve whatever the spell's function is. On occasions, your wizard will receive level ups and be able to learn additional spells and perhaps get bonuses to casting spells, but most of the time they are going to just be starting out with one spell. It depends how your playgroup wants to do this, but normally you randomly determine the spell before each game, like a typical game of Warhammer. So that means rolling a d6 and seeing which one you got on the chart that is listed for your wizard. Spells can never cause critical hits. Models always receive armor saves against wounds caused by spells, unless the spell notes otherwise. And if you happen to be a wizard that can use and or learns multiple spells, and you roll 2 random dice to see what kind of spell you get, and you get the same spell twice, you are either allowed to re-roll one of the dice to get a different spell, or keep that one spell, but reduce its difficulty to cast by 1. You are also only allowed to cast one spell per turn with each of your wizards. If your wizard is casting a direct damage spell, these are resolved in the same way as a shooting attack or blows in hand-to-hand combat. And speaking of which, you are allowed to cast spells even in hand-to-hand combat. So the final phase in the turn sequence is here, and we're going to break it down. And I'm talking about the close combat phase. As long as your models are engaged with each other, as in they're touching one point of each other's bases, doesn't matter if it's the front, side, or rear, they are able to make attacks on each other. And the way that you determine who is going to be attacking first is normally by initiative. But if someone charged during this turn, they get the always strikes first rule. This can supersede the opponent's higher initiative, if that's the case. This is allowed to take precedent over an opponent that has a higher initiative. However, it's only going to count for that first turn where your character made the successful charge. In the event the combat will continue on to further turns, it will then roll over to who has the highest initiative on those turns. It should be noted that sometimes you'll have your characters getting knocked down during a melee conflict, and in the event that they stand up during that turn, they will always strike last if they are involved in a melee, regardless of any other modifiers. In the event you do have a tie in, say, initiative, where it's the second round of combat, I'm initiative 4 and my opponent's initiative 4. Or you have some kind of really, really weird circumstance where you have two models that are both with that always strikes last condition, and they happen to have the same initiative as well, we'll say. Well, in that case, you're going to roll a d6 with your opponent, and whoever gets the higher die is going to strike first. If you happen to be engaged with multiple targets in a close combat, and your character has multiple attacks, you are allowed to allocate them with however many models are you're in base contact with in whatever manner you desire. As in, if I'm engaged with 3 targets and I have 3 attacks, I could put 1 attack on each of them, or maybe one of them's the boss of the Warband. I could put all of my attacks just on the boss if I desire, as long as he's in base contact. So once you've determined who should be attacking in what order, you gotta roll a d6 for each attack that first model should have. The dice roll needed to score a hit on your enemy depends what their weapon skill is and what your weapon skill is. I'm gonna put the chart up here, but if I had to give a quick rule of thumb to help anyone playing this game, if the weapon skill of you and your opponent is equal, you're going to be hitting each other on 4s. If one of you has a 1 point higher weapon skill than the enemy, well then that person's going to be hitting on 3s, and the other person is going to be hitting them on 4s. And this is the case for most attacks. The only exception to this is if your weapon skill is double plus 1 of your opponent's, as in, say, they have a weapon skill of 3 and I have a weapon skill of 7, then, in that case, they will be hitting you on 5s. You will still hit them on 3s. This is a little different than the past couple editions of Warhammer Fantasy, and Warhammer the Old World as well. I kind of lumped that in there. So just make sure you're paying attention to that. I know that in a lot of those systems, if you have double plus 1, the opponent's weapon skill, you will hit them on 2s. This is not the case in Mordheim. You hit them on 3s, but the other half of them hitting you on 5s is still the case in this game. So once a character has made a successful attack on another, you will roll to wound. This is done very similar to the wound section I was talking about in the shooting part of the video, but it has a little bit of a caveat. You always take the base strength of the model that's attacking, and you will apply any modifiers that their melee weapon might give, such as a halberd, which gives +1 strength to the user. Once you have the total, you will compare that to the opponent's toughness. You can consult the chart here to see what you would be wounding on, but again, for just quick suggestions, if the strength is equal to the opponent's toughness, you will be wounding them on 4s. If it's 1 higher, you will wound them on 3s, and if it's 2 higher, you wound them on 2s. And the opposite of that, if your strength is 1 less than your opponent, you're going to be wounding them on 5s, and if it's 2 less, you're going to be wounding them on 6s. And please make note, just like a shooting attack, once there's such a high indifference between the strength and toughness, it will become almost impossible to wound the target. You deal critical hits in a melee the exact same way I was talking about with the shooting attack. If you happen to roll a 6 with the to wound roll, that'll trigger the critical hit effect for that weapon. Additionally, the armor save modifiers will work in the same way. If I have a 4+ save because I have heavy armor and a shield, and my opponent has a strength 4 attack, I will get a -1 modifier. My 4+ save will become a 5+ save. If the target is wounded and fails their armor save, they take a wound. If their wound characteristics are reduced to 0, you are going to roll on a special chart, and you are going to roll an amount of times equal to the amount of wounds that put you below 0. Just to give an example, if I'm just a human militia guy with 1 wound, and I'm in combat with an ogre who's got 3 attacks, and he landed every single one of the attacks, he wounded with all of them, I failed all my saves, well, I just took 3 wounds, and that ogre is going to roll 3 dice on the injury chart. The injury chart works as follows: 1 to 2, knocked down; 3 to 4, stunned; 5 to 6, out of action. If a character's been knocked down, you're going to want to put a face up to represent that it has been knocked down. They can crawl 2 inches during the movement phase, but may not fight in hand-to-hand combat, shoot, or cast spells. If you're in base-to-base contact with an enemy, a knockdown model can crawl 2 inches away, only if the enemy is engaged in hand-to-hand combat with another opponent. Otherwise, he has to stay where he is, and that's not a good thing. In combat, he cannot strike back, and the enemy will have a good chance of putting him out of action. We will go over that very soon, though. A warrior who's been knocked down may stand up at the start of his next turn. This is during that recovery phase we went over at the start of the video. In that turn, he may move at half rate, shoot, and cast spells. However, he cannot charge or run. If he's engaged in hand-to-hand combat, he may not move away and will automatically strike last, which is something I covered a little bit earlier. And this is irrespective of the weapons or initiative that are in effect. After this turn, the fighter moves and fights normally, though, even though he has 0 wounds left. If the model takes any further wounds, you continue to roll on the injury chart as I explained earlier. 3 to 4 is the stunned result. You will turn the model completely face down to show that they've been stunned. A fighter who is stunned may do nothing at all. A player may turn the model face up in their next recovery phase, at which point they are considered to be treated as knocked down instead of stunned, which means you basically have a whole other turn to wait before they can actually stand back up. So you can see why stunned is a pretty bad result. But now we've got the worst of the worst, and this one's pretty self-explanatory. Out of action, your character is considered at a stage where he can no longer fight in the battle. He might not necessarily be dead. We're going to roll on an injury chart that I will go into either later in this video or in a separate one for campaign-related affairs. But again, when it comes to this battle, they've considered to taking such a severe injury that they are no longer able to contribute. If an enemy is engaged with a warrior who is knocked down, he may attack him and put him out of his misery quite easily. All attacks made against the warrior who is knocked down hit automatically. If any of the attacks should wound the knockdown target and they fail their armor save, they're automatically taken out of action. There's no need to roll on the chart again. A stunned warrior is almost completely at the mercy of their enemy. A model who is stunned is automatically taken out of action if an enemy can attack him in a hand-to-hand combat. And I'll go over this again in a later part of the video, but it should just be noted that if you are knocked down, you are unable to make a parry save against the attacks made on you because they automatically hit. There are a couple of other exception and caveat rules to make note of when you are engaging with knockdown or stunned models in a melee. It should be noted that, say, that ogre, from example, who had 3 attacks against the Empire militiamen. Say his first attack would have knocked down the opponent or stunned him. I can't then say, oh, well, I have 2 more attacks, and those attacks will automatically hit you or just automatically take you out of action because you're already knocked down. That's not how it works. I would have had to have rolled all the dice at the same time, and I would have had to hope that I would have gotten those results when I rolled for the injuries at the appropriate time. So, there are exceptions to this, though. Say that Ogre had an ally also involved in that combat, and the Ogre swung first, and he stunned the Empire militiamen that he was engaged in combat with. Well, then the Ogre's ally will automatically be able to benefit from that result. Say that the Ogre stunned that model. Well, now his ally hasn't been able to attack yet, and he will automatically be able to take that model out of action. There is an exception to this, though. If your model is engaged in close combat with an enemy who is still standing, you cannot attack the other model that is stunned or knocked down in that combat, since in reality they will pose no immediate threat to him and their companions will try to protect them. So, again, just to make sure that rule is clearly illustrated here, that Ogre, say he was fighting 2 Empire militiamen, and the Ogre also has an ally involved in this combat, so it's a 2-on-2. If the Ogre knocks down and puts all of his attacks on one of those Empire militiamen, then the Ogre's ally cannot just automatically hit that knocked down target. Instead, the ally of the Ogre is going to have to put all of his attacks on the still standing Empire militiamen, as he will be trying his best to defend his knockdown companion and also pose a greater threat for the current combat situation. Once models are engaged in hand-to-hand combat, they cannot move away during their movement phase. They must fight it out until one of them is taken out of action, or until one of them decides to break and run away, which we will be going over soon in the psychology phase. The only exception to this rule is something I kind of mentioned earlier. If the attacking model is engaged with all opponents that are knocked down or stunned, he may actually move away from that combat if desired, or even charge another enemy within range. And additionally, if there's a combat involved and one of the models is knocked down, they can try to make a 2-inch crawl away. And that's only if that model already has another ally involved in that combat that can kind of cover their retreat as they crawl away to safety. We'll be going over psychology very soon, but since it pertains to this current situation, if a warrior happens to break from a combat due to some failed psychology or panic test, all opponents that are involved in that combat are entitled to 1 free hit against that opponent that fled from the combat. And that's going to conclude all of the little caveats and exceptions to the close combat phase. We are now going to talk about leadership and psychology. And we're going to start with one of the most important things, the route test. So, your warband has a starting number size. Let's say it's 12. When that warband is reduced by 25%, as in you have 25% of the models out of action in a game, they are required to make a route test. So again, if I have a starting warband size for the game of 12 models, when I lose 3 of them, I am going to be required to make a route test at the start of my turn. This is done by just making a leadership test on whatever model is the designated leader of the warband. If they pass the test, all is well and you may continue to fight. If the warband's leader is out of action or stunned, then the player may not use his leadership to take the test. Instead, use the highest leadership characteristic amongst the remaining fighters who are not stunned or out of action. Additionally, if you happen to be at that 25% threshold or lower, you can also choose to just voluntarily route. Although if you're just playing a 1v1 game, I don't really see much of the point in that. This is more important for players that are playing in some kind of league or campaign-based setting where your warband is going to be carrying over from one game to another. You might find it actually strategically favorable to rout in these situations instead of letting more of your warband get killed off potentially in a battle. But again, you can only do a voluntary rout if you are already below or equal to that 25% threshold, and it's the start of your turn. You can't rout in the middle of your opponent's turn. Nor can you rout at the end of your turn. Say you had a bunch of charges that you thought were going to go great, and all the combats completely flopped on you. Unfortunately, you're going to have to take a beating for one more turn as your opponent plays his out, and then when it's the start of yours, you can rout them. As already mentioned, your leader is somewhat unable to confer his benefits to your warband if he happens to be stunned, knocked down, or fleeing. But if that is not the case, he has about a 6-inch command bubble, in which case any model within that range can use his leadership characteristic if it's required. Being outnumbered in Mordheim is probably one of the key times that you're going to have to be making psychological tests. If you happen to be fighting in a combat 2-1 and there are no other friendly models within 6 inches, it should be noted that knocked down, stunned, or fleeing models, even if they're actually your allies, they do not count if they're within 6 inches. So it needs to be a model with none of those conditions within 6 inches of the model that's engaged. If you're engaged with no other friends within 6 inches and you're fighting 2 opponents, you or more, you're going to have to make a leadership test. I've already described this earlier, but this is done by rolling 2d6 and getting equal to or under the listed LD value for your model. If the warrior scores equal to or under his leadership, he's fine. If the score is greater than his leadership, he breaks from the combat and runs. And as mentioned earlier, each of the opponents he's fighting with are entitled to 1 automatic hit against him as he turns and runs away. If he survives those attacks, he will flee 2d6 directly away from his enemies. At the start of each of that character's turns, he's going to have to make another leadership test. If he passes, he'll stop there, but can't do anything else during the turn, except cast spells. If he fails or is charged, he continues to run 2d6 towards the nearest table edge, avoiding any enemy models. If he reaches the table edge before he's managed to recover his nerves, he's removed from the combat. There are a few other psychological effects that are common in games of Mordheim, such as fear. If a model has the fear key rule, what'll happen is, if they are charging an opponent that doesn't cause fear, that opponent will have to make a leadership test. And if they fail that leadership test, they will only be able to hit the fear-causing model on rolls of 6s. Now let's say the opposite situation is happening, where a non-fear-causing model wants to charge a fear-causing model. Well, the non-fear-causing model will have to make a leadership test, and if it's passed, they will be allowed to charge as normal. If it's failed, they will actually have to treat this as a failed charge and basically just sit there quivering in their boots. Frenzy will give you double your standard listed attack profile amount worth of attacks. So if I have 2 attacks, I will now have 4 attacks. If I have 1 attack, I will have 2 attacks. I don't add a bonus for, say, having 2 hand weapons before I do this. So let's say I have 2 attacks and I get +1 for additional hand weapons. I don't receive 6 attacks. I would receive 4 attacks from the frenzy rule and then an additional +1 for the additional hand weapon. There's additional psychological effects to frenzy. Once you've declared all of your charges, you will be required to check and see if any of your frenzied models are within charge range. If they are, you have no choice in the matter, and they will automatically declare the charge. Once a frenzied warrior is within charge range, they are considered completely immune to all psychological effects, such as fear. They don't have to take any kind of test for the remainder of the combat, unless they are knocked down or stunned. at which point the model is no longer considered frenzied, and they will continue to fight as normal for the remainder of this battle. Hatred will allow you to reroll any of your misses on the first round of a close combat. After that initial round, though, you will continue to fight as normal. Stupidity works a little bit different than your typical games of Warhammer, although the manner that you test it is exactly the same. Any model that has the stupidity keyword is going to roll 2d6 and make a leadership test at the start of every turn. If they fail the test until the start of their next turn, they will be unable to cast spells or fight in hand-to-hand combat. But that does mean the opponent, if they happen to be engaged in hand-to-hand combat, still gets to attack them and has to roll the hit and such as normal. If you fail the stupidity test and are not engaged in hand-to-hand combat, you're going to roll a d6 and consult this little stupidity chart. It's basically on a 1 to a 3, you're going to move half your movement value in a shambling manner forward, and if there happens to be a ledge or something like that, the edge of a building, you will go off of it, or you're going to hit an obstacle in the way, and you cannot shoot during that turn. And if you happen to get a 4 to a 6, you're just going to basically sit there and be drooling and do absolutely nothing. Other than that, if you do pass the leadership test, the model is allowed to operate as normal. But again, we'll be required to make a stupidity test again on the following turn. And that's going to cover all the basics that you need to know to actually play a game of Mordheim. And I would highly suggest you do so because it is one of my favorite tabletop games I've ever played. I seriously mean it when I say I think it's one of the best products Games Workshop has ever designed. I will very quickly here go over how to build a warband and a little bit into weapons and armor and some of the additional rules that I like to play this game with, but it's not going to be all encompassing like the prior section I just did because I already know how long this video is getting. So we are going to be using the Ostlander warband sheet here, mainly because I've been demoing most of the features on the video so far with an Ostland warband. Whatever warband you want to play, its information can be found on the Mordheim website, and I'll put that up on the screen right now, but it's also provided in all the links in the description. It is the most useful resource when it comes to anything Mordheim related. And if you're using any of the, I believe it's 1A through like B series warbands, those are all like official ones that were released by Games Workshop. They have a little key that you can see there to figure all this out. But if you're using any of those, the layout is probably going to be identical to what I'm showing you here. The first sheet is going to tell you how many gold coins you get to spend on your warband. This is in terms of Warhammer. This is how many points you get to spend on your army. It'll tell you how much starting XP you get. You can roll for some skills and stuff for your characters based on whatever level ups they get on their starting XP. And it'll also tell you what kind of units you are required to take for the start. Normally, this isn't too extensive. You just need to have a leader and a couple of other minis, like 1 or 2 heroes and a couple of henchmen. And then the rest is up to you. But it'll also tell you your limits, as in you can normally only have 1 leader character, and you can't just take an army of all ogres. Unless, of course, you're playing a warband that is just ogres, maybe. Maybe then you can do that. The last thing to make note of on this starting sheet is sometimes your army will have a couple of special rules. It looks like for Ostlanders, you have a self-sufficient rule, and those will all be kind of listed here or on the following page. In the main rulebook, as well as each respective warband's little sheet area, you will find a cap for your characteristics. So in Mordheim, I mentioned you will gain XP and your characters will level up. There are limitations on how far they can level up their characteristics, and these are the maximum capabilities for whatever type of character it is. For Ostlanders, you have a limit on human-type characters and ogres. So if I was playing an Orcs and Goblins army, my characteristic limitations would probably be a little bit different. But again, these are the limits for the warband we're demoing here. Additionally, the second and third page will normally have some unique weapons and armor, and perhaps some other types of items that are only available to that warband. And these are the rules on how they will work. You can normally purchase these throughout your campaign, and again, oftentimes they will only be available to your warband. There is also a common pool of items that anyone can purchase from, but I will be going over that a little bit later. After those pages, you should find what is known as your warband's armory. These are all the weapons and equipment that will be available to that warband at the start of a campaign. Additionally, as you progress, these will tell you what type of weapons and armor your characters can wear for later endeavors. For example, like you probably won't be able to purchase heavy armor for everyone. Not everyone in a warband can typically wear heavy armor. This is the area you can go to see what type of equipment each of your troops can use. It'll also normally be listed in their respective profile descriptions, which we will be getting to very soon. The final thing on this sheet here is at the very bottom, your skill table. As you gain XP, you will level up. I've said this a few times throughout the video, and I will break down the full mechanics of it very soon. But when you get a level up, you will typically be able to pick out new skills for your characters. However, let's say like I'm an archer-based character. That normally means I'm restricted to shooting-based skills for my level up. I wouldn't necessarily be able to pick wizard skills, or as they're known in this game, academic skills for that character when he levels up. The next couple of pages will first list the cost for each of your heroes, their special abilities, what kind of gear they have, and all of their stats. The page after that will list all of your henchmen's stats, abilities, gear, etc. After that, we get to what are known as unique skills. These are ones that are in flavor for whatever warband that you ended up picking, and typically they are only available to that warband. And typically they will be available to anyone in the warband, and if that's not the case, it should note it within the description of the ability. The very last thing, some warbands might not have this, because it'll either be in the main rulebook or they don't have any spellcasters, is sometimes a warband will have a unique lore that is only available to them, and the spells will be listed in the very back. And that's going to conclude everything you need to know about setting up your first Mordheim warband. Just to go over a little bit of an example process, I will show what I would do with the 500 crowns an Ostlin warband gets for the start. And here you go on the screen. You can check it out, see all my little purchases and stuff that I made. They also gave some examples of some starting level up skills that I might have gotten for my characters. This is just a suggestion for anyone that might be planning out a Mordheim campaign. If it's on the longer end, as in you guys plan on doing more than, say, 4 or 5 games, I would highly recommend having the amount of starting XP you get. This isn't because I think you get too powerful too quickly. I think that the problem is more so in Mordheim you'll level up and you'll just get so many skills and things going on with each of your characters. It can get a little overwhelming at the later stages of the game. So having the amount of starting XP you get is a good way of kind of buffering that from happening if you got a very extensive campaign planned out. But if you've only got planned, like, I would say 4 to maybe 6 games maximum, this is a pretty good level to still work with, just the starting XP they give you. I'm not going to go over it in this video, but they also do have rules in the main rulebook if you wanted to just build a one-off army and give them level ups and spend money on specific level ups for your character. As in, if you were doing a one-off scenario and you really wanted your guy to have, like, Eagle Eye, I think that's one of the skills. You could pay like a certain amount just to have that. Or if you wanted him to have a better ballistic skill at the start, you could pay for him to have that because it's just a one-shot battle for your warband. But I don't really do this that often, to be honest with you. I don't think I actually ever have in like my 10-15 years of playing Mordheim. I always kind of just build my warband around the starting amounts listed, and when it comes to XP, I'll kind of just take whatever I can get at the start. Sometimes we do half, sometimes we do the full amount. Doesn't really matter too much to me. So after I've got my warband all set and ready to go, I am going to play in my first battle. A lot of times, if you're playing in some kind of campaign with a bunch of players, These will be predetermined to create some kind of narrative structure for the adventure you guys are going through. But if you're not doing anything like that, you will either randomly determine what scenario you get, or the warband with the lower warband rating will be able to pick it. Warband rating is basically a combination of the starting XP, the amount of guys you have, and like the gold spent. You add up like all of those numbers and you get a warband rating number. And your opponent will have one as well. I think if it's a tie, you just roll off. Additionally, if the warband rating and difference is super high between you two, the underdog will basically get a bonus for playing in that game. It's kind of a little compensation for the butt kicking that they're probably going to take. But hopefully after that first game, the compensation will balance them out enough that they'll be able to participate with everyone else. But I often find it's best to just have everyone start together in a game of Mordheim. I'm not saying it's impossible to have a warband defeated halfway through a campaign and bring in a new one. Quite the contrary, I've actually seen that happen a few times, and those warbands either do really well or sometimes even end up winning the whole thing. So, yeah, I'm not saying that's impossible or anything, just it's a lot harder, and you're going to definitely notice some setbacks that you have to face right off the bat going in against veteran warbands with much higher ratings. So now you've got your warband ready, hopefully your opponent does as well, and you've got a battle picked out. You guys are going to play out the scenario, try to do your best to accomplish the objectives. Each scenario should have a little bit of a description as to the way you should deploy, how long the game's going to go, what kind of objectives are present, and a general layout of how the terrain should be on the battlefield. If it doesn't, I'm just going to tell you right now, one of the biggest selling features of Mordheim is having a lot of terrain and a lot of verticality on the board. Once you got all that set up, you guys are going to play the battle. There are a couple of things you're going to want to make note of during your game. Specifically, any time one of your models takes another of the enemy's models out of action, you're going to fill in one of those little bubbles on the sheet underneath your unit description. I listed these much earlier, but I will put it here, and I will have a link to these in the video description. These are your warband roster sheets, and they have a little XP bar at the bottom to keep track. Make note that heroes and henchmen have different types of XP bars. And each time your character gets to one of those bold squares of the XP bar, that's going to be a level up. And post-game, I will kind of go into that very soon. They are going to be rolling on their respective level up charts. Whether they're a henchman or a hero, they each have their own. The other thing you're going to need to make note of is each time one of your characters gets taken out of action in a game of Mordheim. I mentioned this earlier as well. They aren't necessarily dead. Far from it. They might just sustain some kind of injury, like a crippled hand, or they might actually be fully fine and just come back in tip-top shape. Or they might get sold into the pits to fight in some kind of arena, and they'll have to fight for their lives and earn the fame of the crowd if they want to escape. And the very last thing is any additional treasures or, pieces of weirdstone you might have came across during the battle. You will want to make note of each of those as well. So after the game is concluded and the winner and loser has been decided, you are all going to receive some kind of reward based on the scenario and how you came out with it. Sometimes the winner will get additional XP, or they'll get some kind of additional treasure, and normally the loser still receives some kind of compensation XP, but it'll be a little bit less, and same goes with the treasures. So after all of your earnings have been dealt out, you will have to roll on the injury table for each character that's been taken out of action. Henchman is very simple. You roll a d6 for each of them, and on a 1 or a 2, they're dead. On anything higher, they're fine, and they will be participating in the next battle. Heroes are a little bit more elaborate. They have what is called a d66 chart. So you roll 1d6, and you see what that number is. That's going to be the first number in the formula. Then you roll another d6, and that's your second number. So say I rolled a 2 and then a 4. That's going to be 24. And then I'm going to check the injury chart and see what the result is and apply that to my character. After that, we are going to be rolling for our level ups. This is done by rolling 2d6 on, again, the respective chart of either a hero or a henchman based on their classification in your warband section, and then just seeing the result. If you leveled up one of your core attributes, such as your weapon skill, your attacks, or your wounds, you can add a +1 to this, but as I made note earlier, it'll either be in your respective warband section or in the main rulebook. Each kind of race or warband in Mordheim has a cap on these, so make sure you check that and that you aren't going over the cap. If you do happen to go over the cap, you are allowed to basically re-roll the result. It's not like your level up is just null and void. Additionally, this is when your characters are going to get new skills. This is a very common result on the level up roll. I mentioned this earlier. In your warband section, it's going to tell you what type of level up skills each character can take. Again, if I'm an archer, most likely I can't take a academic wizard skill, and vice versa. The wizard can't normally take a archer-based skill, or shooting skill as it's called in Mordheim. Each of the charts for these skills can be found in the main rulebook, and your army's unique skills can be found near the back of their warband sections. After you have completed all of your level ups, you will begin the exploration phase. And normally you're going to want to be doing these phases at the same time as the player you just played against and be keeping track of your results. There's a good chance that even though you might have won or been defeated in your battle, that one of you might actually come out the superior player based on how your performance goes in the post-game steps like this. One of you might have gotten better level ups than the other, or one of you might get a really good exploration phase. This is done by rolling a d6 for each of your heroes that survived the battle, up to a maximum of 6. Sometimes there will be special items or skills that can modify these results, such as you might find a map of Mordheim that lets you re-roll one of the dice that you're about to get. Once you roll all the dice, you are going to add up the total, and that is going to tell you the amount of weird stone your warband came across during their exploration. This can be sold at merchants, or sometimes you might want to hold on to it if you're doing a campaign and that's how you're scored at the very end based on your weird stone stash. That's always a fun mechanic, because then you're like, ooh, do I want to keep it or do I want to sell it and upgrade my guys? I'm falling behind. I might really need some upgrades right now. So anyways, it's a very fun mechanic, and you'll have to decide what you want to do based on your campaign. But that total is going to tell you the amount of weird stone you got. And you're going to want to keep track of how many doubles, triples, or quadruples you roll on those dice. As in, if I got 2 2s on the rolls, that's actually going to be a special result. It actually turns out that's a shop. So I'll just go over that one really quick, because there's tons of these and I really don't have the time, and I'm sure you don't either, for me to go through 60 random event things that can happen here. So I found a shop. After a thorough search, you find loot worth d6 gold coins. If you roll 1, you also find a lucky charm. And I gotta go to the merchant section of the rulebook to basically see what the stats on the lucky charm are. So that's pretty cool. And again, that's in addition to all the weird stone my warband found during the exploration phase. After all of the exploration phase is concluded, you're probably going to want to make a new total of all of your treasures and earnings, and you're going to have to decide if you want to sell some of your weird stone. You are going to consult a chart, and I'm going to put it up here, that tells you based on your warband size how much gold coin you'll get in return for the amount of weird stone you sell. You'll notice these numbers aren't necessarily even, and it adds a little bit of strategy to your campaign when you want to hold on to and when you want to sell your weird stone. Generally, it's better to sell it early on when you have smaller numbers and you can get better payout for it. This also helps people who are just jumping into a campaign kind of catch up to those bigger war bands. And hopefully now you have tons of gold coins to spend at the merchant. You can also choose to sell your items to the merchant for half of their value. You're free to buy and sell whatever you feel like, but you should make note of what equipment is actually usable by each of your characters. It'll say this in your respective warband sections. And sometimes a skill can let you kind of break those rules. I know there's one that's called like Weapon Master or something like that, and it allows your character to basically use any kind of weapon he gets his hand on instead of his normal restrictions. Something else restrictive at the merchant is you'll notice that certain items have a rareness associated with them. This is to represent the chance of the merchant basically having the item actually on stock, ready and able to be sold to your warband. This isn't always a guarantee for more exotic items. So, if an item has the word common next to it, there's no need to roll. It'll always be there and you can buy as many as you need to. If it has a rareness, you need to roll 2d6 to see if the item's available, and your roll needs to be equal to or higher than the rareness of the item. And this represents your chance of the merchant having it, your warband going around looking for this rare item, and so on. If you get the roll, as in you roll the 2d6 and it's equal to or higher than the rareness value, you can purchase one of those items. You are allowed to search for rare items in this manner for as many times as you have active heroes in your warband. So if I have 4 heroes, I can attempt to search for 4 rare items. The final thing I want to make note of for the actual price chart here is there's also a chance that something you want to buy has a variance in price, as in there's like no set market price for the item. It could be 10 gold or sometimes it could cost 16 gold. You'll see this oftentimes listed as like the gold value is 2d6. So that's exactly what it is. You would roll 2d6, there's a chance you could get for 2 gold, and there's a chance you can get for 12 gold. There are many types of weapons and armor to equip your troops with in games of Mordheim, and I won't go over the description of how each of them are going to work, but if you look in the armory section of the Mordheim rulebook, you will find a description for each weapon and how it's supposed to work in the game. Unless otherwise stated, all ranged weapons have 1 attack. Melee weapons will either be single-handed or two-handed. If they are single-handed, you're allowed to dual wield, have 1 weapon in each hand, and if they're two-handed, obviously your hands are occupied wielding whatever big sword or flail you have, and you can't have anything in your offhand in that situation. Most ranged weapons are going to be two-handed, but there are a few that are single-handed, as in you can dual wield the ranged weapon, such as pistols. You will want to check the special rules for those weapons, or any weapon that you're equipping your troop with, because almost all of them have a special rule associated with them in the armory section. If you can't find a weapon inside of that area, it's most likely a special item that is only usable by your warband, and it'll be found in your warband's armory section. Some armor, such as a helmet, will also have unique rules associated with it, so you'll also want to check in the armory section the rules for whatever armor you're equipping your troops with. In fact, if there's any item that you're curious as to what its implementation is in the game, it can most likely be found in the armory section or the miscellaneous equipment section of the main rulebook. In addition to hiring mercenaries, you can also hire new henchmen or heroes during this phase. If you wish to purchase them and they're just fresh recruits, the process is easy and you just pay the listed amount. But if, say you have a group of henchmen that has already leveled up a couple of times, they have like 4 or 5 XP, and they lost a man and you want to add to that group, get them back to that maximum size, well, you don't just pay the base cost. Instead, you have to see if someone that skilled is available in the mercenary or like recruitment pool, basically at that time. To do so, you're going to roll 2 dice, and that's the amount of XP you have available at that time to spend on a new henchman. So to give an example, I'm going to roll 2 dice. I got a 7. So that means I can buy henchmen that have an experience value of up to 7, or say my group had less XP. They only needed 3 XP per guy in that group. Well, in that case, I could buy 2 henchmen for that group. And you roll that 2d6 each time you're at the purchase phase after a battle. It's different each time. If you are purchasing a henchman to an already existing group, he'll come in with all the existing traits that they have. Say like they got +1 ballistic skill. He'll have that +1 ballistic skill, but you need to purchase all of his weapons and armor. He's not going to just come with any of that. And in addition to all of these little stipulations, you also need to add 2 gold to the base cost per XP that he has. So earlier I said 5 XP for the group. If he had 5 XP, that would be 10 additional gold or points for his cost. So if it was 14 points or gold to get him as a base cost, and he had 5 XP, the total is now 24. You can recruit whatever type of warrior or hero that you wish. The usual restrictions apply. You can't have multiple leaders and like multiple wizards if your warband's limited to 1. If you do want a new one, you're going to have to fire your old one and replace him with a new one. Anyways, after all of your business with the merchants is concluded, you're going to want to update your sheet with all of your new earnings, and then you will be ready for your next game of Mordheim. The last couple of things I'm going to cover here in the video are just some super bonus stuff that you can play with. I don't think it's necessary to have a good game of Mordheim, but again, this is typically stuff we like to play with. I even mentioned this stuff much earlier in the video when I kind of talk about all the bonus stuff we like to play with. The first thing is mercenaries or hired swords. These are most of the time individuals that you can hire for specific warbands that aren't part of your standard roster, but can be a part of your warband by paying an upkeep cost for each game that they play in. Some of these are very powerful and can definitely give your warband a cutting edge. I've always been a fan of including ogre bodyguards, dwarven treasure hunters or slayers. There are a couple other ones that I like, but the problem is that per game upkeep can kind of cripple your warband early on if you're not making big advancements. So I find that they're kind of a luxury for later in the game when you've already kind of established your core warband and people have already started leveling up and maybe you have a couple of guys sitting on the side in case you have injuries. I find that's the best time to incorporate hired swords or mercenaries. But again, if you want to include them in your army, they're going to be a purchase that you're going to make when you like visit a merchant. Sometimes if it's a legendary hired sword, you will have to roll like you would a rare item on the merchant chart to see if they're actually available. And if they aren't, you'll have to wait around until the next game you play and see if they show up that time. Next, we're going to be talking about the random happenings table. So, at the start of each player's turn, they are going to roll dice. And on the event of a 1, a random happening has occurred. You are going to roll a d6, so the first number will be the 10 interval number. So if I roll a 6, it will be 60. And then I roll the second dice, and if it's a 2, it would be 62. That's what I mean by d6. I've described this earlier in the video, but in case there was any confusion, just figured I'd repeat it here. And yeah, you will see what number you get on this pretty extensive chart of random happenings. I think this is probably one of the coolest things about the tabletop in comparison to like the video game if you happen to play it. I knew when I was playing that video game, I was like, there's no way they're going to be able to incorporate the wackiness of Mordheim's random happening chart. And indeed they did not. It's still a fun game, but yeah, it's just not really possible, I feel like, to translate it one for one. The random happenings table is exactly what it sounds like. There's just so many things that could occur in the middle of your game of Mordheim, and it really spices it up. I'm a huge fan of this table and would definitely recommend anyone who is planning on playing this with like a large group of players over an extensive period of time looks into the random happenings table and making sure that they have all the miniatures needed to incorporate on their table for all the events. That's the only reason like I hesitate to even say like maybe don't run it if you don't have a big miniature collection or anything and you don't think you could really provide like a good experience for all these events. You know, you could always tweak them too. For example, if you got a swarm of rats and you don't own a rat swarm, you could always use a snotling swarm or something like that, you know what I mean? And the rules are the same, it's just like the miniatures are different. But if you happen to be someone that doesn't own any swarm-like stuff, I could understand hesitating to use this, which is why I put it in the optional section here. But again, if you roll 1 at the start of your turn, you will then roll the d6, and you will check on this table to see what random event you got. They all have pretty extensive descriptions in how they should be implemented in your game, and they're all kind of case by case. So I can't really give you an overall tutorial breakdown on each of those, because then this video is going to be like 5 hours long. But yeah, that's how you actually roll and get a random happening, and you check this table to see what it is. The black powder misfire table is pretty simple. When rolling to hit with a black powder weapon, such as a handgun or a pistol, if you roll 1, you roll another d6 immediately after, and you check the chart shown here. This is here to represent an earlier era in Warhammer's timeline, and black powder weapons are very risky and volatile to explosions or all kinds of mishaps. So people are kind of cautious when using them, but they are very powerful, so they are tempting to use. And on this misfire, if you happen to roll a 6, your shot was overloaded and it's actually going to hit even harder. So there's actually a chance that something good could come out of this misfire chart, but majority of these results are not good. And there's a chance that you could lose your expensive black powder weapon. It could just explode in your hand and then it's gone. So you got to kind of approach with caution when using these. This is not a house rule or anything. This is an official thing from Mordheim or Games Workshop. If you are going to play with these rules, they say you are going to use a 20% discount across all black powder weapons to kind of balance out the chart's implementation. Escaping from combat allows your character to bypass the situation where he's in an unfavorable combat, and normally he's not allowed to leave it unless he fails a psychology-based test. Somewhat ironically, to do so, if he wants to escape the combat, he has to pass a leadership test. If he passes, he gets to move his maximum distance away from the combat. If he fails, the opponents get 1 automatic hit on him. He will still run, but instead of going double his movement value, he will go 2d6, and he will have to make a leadership test to rally on the following turn. I'm going to give a quick rationale to all of my little optional house rules here. Again, I didn't come up with any of these. These are rules that I have largely seen at play amongst Mordheim community members that have probably actually been playing this game longer than I have. I think a lot of these help balance the game out, but if you're playing for the first time or even just doing your first kind of 5 or 6 games, I would definitely recommend skipping these and just seeing how you and your community feel about the game and if any of these changes are needed before you go ahead and implementing all of them. The first one is a 20% discount on all armor. This is because of the cost of armor kind of being overpriced and the relation of the armor save being modified by strength. A lot of times as your Warband progresses and gets better strength values from level ups and gets better equipment, which gives them better strength, armor will be almost completely null and void in 60 or 70% of situations. And yeah, that's a big reason that we gave it a discount, and we also gave it a +1 bonus to whatever its listed value is. So that means light armor would give a 5-up save, heavy armor would give a 4-up save, and Grommel armor would give a 3-up save. This allows characters to actually get pretty good armor saves and allow them to be implemented in situations where you would normally just never get an armor save in Mordheim. This also creates a bit of a void where there's no 6-up based armor. You could just take a shield for a 6-up save, but yeah, there's no actual armor for a 6-up save. So we added a new armor that can be purchased for 5 gold. I'm kind of skipping around here, but yeah, I'm going to skip to the bottom here because it relates to what I'm talking about. This also just allows players an option to invest a little bit more in the quality of your troops versus taking a mass number of troops, which I kind of find the base game incentivizes a little bit more. Speaking of which, we also have a bit of a change to slings. They're going to count as an unarmored or a dagger attack, so when they hit the opponent, they're going to get a +1 to their armor save. This is because, it's a bit of a well-known fact amongst the Mordheim community that sling spam can be a little bit of a toxic strategy. And this doesn't completely negate it. You can still get tons of sling attacks. They're dirt cheap, and you're fishing for crits anyways. And if you get a really nice critical hit with it, it'll kind of bypass the armor anyways. So I think that this is a good compromise. It doesn't completely negate the strategy, but it does kind of balance it out a little bit more, in my opinion. Additionally, that quantity over quality concept is a little bit more embodied in dual wielding tons of chumps in your warband spam and hoping for the best as they progress through a campaign. That's a very common strategy. So to balance that out, we added a -1 modifier to offhands, and that just means that whatever offhand weapon, you're going to roll 1 dice separate for it to represent its attack, and it's going to get a -1 to hit modifier in whatever situation it's in, melee or range based. Again, I don't think this hinders the strategy of taking quantity over quality. It's just there to kind of balance out the decision making of players that do want quality, and it also helps encourage future purchases in your warband instead of that quantity number as you progress through a campaign. All the other optional rules are official ones created by Games Workshop, and I've already discussed them earlier in the video here. So that actually covers all of the kind of modified house rules that we typically use for our games of Mordheim. And again, if you're a bit of a veteran player or you've played a little bit more extensively with your community now, I would recommend trying these out at that point and see if it helps any issues that your player group might have. But they definitely are not necessary to experience the awesomeness of this game. If there is anything you feel like I missed when it comes to covering all of the extensive mechanics of Mordheim, please let me know. I am going to just include a lot of extra stuff that we do tend to play with, but I felt like was a little bit redundant and could be kind of cut out of this video. But yeah, I will include tons of extra content for anyone that's interested in Mordheim to play around with. We use an extended merchant chart, which basically triples the amount of items that's available for the game. I definitely recommend, once you play a little bit, to check that out. And a couple of other special rules, like the Mordheim Well, which is a very fun terrain feature that can be present on your board. It's so easy to get a game of Mordheim going. The miniature count is insanely low. Some of the box kits that I advertised earlier, you could literally buy 1 box and you and a friend will have more than enough to play a full campaign of Mordheim and expand your warband near their max roster size. Terrain, it's kind of up to you. You can do it yourself, or you can look online and get as crazy as you want, buying extensive kits or 3D printing. Again, the world has way more options now than it did back in 1999, and they wanted you to be creative back then, so there's no excuse for not giving this game a try if it's caught your interest and you've watched all the way through here. Seriously, if your friends are being lame and they don't want to make a warband for them and tell them to give the game a try. Play it a few times, see how it goes. If there's anything you want to tweak, check out some of the extended rule mechanics and stuff that I have available in this video here, and let everyone know how it goes in the comments. Again, if there's anything I missed, also mention that in the comments for everyone so we can make this a really extensive resource, a one-stop for all things Mordheim, other than the Broheim website. I can't replace them. They are just like the pinnacle resource when it comes to finding anything you want to know about this game. So, and it's one of the main things that's going to be listed in the video description. So if you want to learn more about the game, either give this video a rewatch, check out specific sections again, or check out the Broheim website or all the other links that are being provided here. I hope this was useful for you, and if you are someone that already knows how to play, you at least got a refresher on how to play the game, maybe learned a mechanic or two you were a little rusty on or just didn't even know about. That was actually the case for me. I've been playing this game for like 10 plus years, and there were a couple of rules or two when I was going over all this stuff, and I was like, oh dang, like I didn't remember it working that way. So I hope that that was the case for you all as well. Have a great day. I'll see you all later. Bye-bye.